Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're not just recounting history, not just looking at, say, a single dramatic event like an
No,
assassination.
we're putting on our forensic gloves, really. We're examining institutional failure at its roots.
Exactly. We're looking at the very systems, the laws in ancient Greece and Rome that were supposed to hold things together, prevent tyranny, stop wholesale betrayal. And we're asking, how did they actually break down, especially when faced with, enormous personal power?
That's the plan. We're taking this fascinating stack of sources you've brought us, everything from the earliest Greek law codes right up to the big philosophical debates in the late Roman Republic.
Quite a range.
It is, and we want to sort of strip it all back. We're trying to expose these fundamental tensions, these constitutional weak points. Two big conflicts really stand out.
Which are?
First, this really difficult struggle to move away from pure personal vengeance, blood feuds, and replace it with something like state-controlled justice. That was a huge leap.
And the second.
The second is what happens when the laws you have just don't anticipate someone getting too powerful militarily, politically. The lines get incredibly blurry. Is taking that person out a noble act, like tyrannicide? Or is it just treason, murder?
And does the law even have an answer at that point?
That's the question, isn't it? Does the legal system just stall?
Our source materials are, well, they're incredible. We're drawing from those early Greek figures, people like Dracon and Solon, looking at how Athenian democracy worked on the ground.
And then we jump over to Rome. We've got Cicero's legal thinking, the structure of the Republic, even later stuff like Justinian's Digest, trying to make sense of it all.
So the big question hanging over this whole deep dive, it feels very relevant, actually. When overwhelming power, whether it's one person's political clout, a general's army, maybe even religious authorities, slams up against the established rules, the law, how does the system even categorize the violence that follows? Like the assassination of Caesar, for instance. Was that legally defensible as removing a tyrant, as the conspirators claimed? Or was it simply murder, treason against the head of state, who was also Pontifex Maximus?
Does the law provide a neat answer, or is it always ultimately just politics, force deciding the outcome? That ambiguity, that's where republics tend to unravel. That's the constitutional crisis zone.
Right. Let's start unpacking that. Maybe begin with something that seems obvious now but was truly revolutionary back then: writing the laws down.
Absolutely fundamental.
Our sources are really clear on this point. A written code, having the laws actually written down and accessible, that's the basic condition for fair judgment. It doesn't even matter initially if the laws themselves are perfectly just.
It's about transparency, isn't it? Knowing the rules of the game. If you don't have access to the laws, how can you be sure that justice is being applied equally, or even what the law is?
Before written codes, especially in early Greek cities with aristocratic governments, the laws are often just tradition. Unwritten customs known maybe only to the elite, the ruling families.
Right, the Eupatridae in Athens, for example. They could basically interpret ancestral law however suited them. Justice could feel completely arbitrary. It depended on who was judging and, frankly, who you were.
And people pushed back against that. The demand from ordinary citizens wasn't always for nicer laws at first. It was just for fixed laws, something they could see, something that couldn't be changed on a whim.
We see this demand driving the work of those early lawgivers. You mentioned Zaleucus for the Locrians, Charondas in Sicily.
But the really famous ones, especially for Athens, are Dracon and Solon.
Dracon, yeah, famous for being incredibly harsh. Almost everything carried the death penalty, or so the stories go. His name even gives us draconian.
But he wrote them down. That was the key step.
And then Solon, who came later, he didn't just codify, he reformed. He tried to make punishments more proportional, and crucially, he made the laws public, accessible, set them up on wooden tablets in a public place.
That act of writing, of making the law public record, it's the first big move towards formal equality under the law. But let's dig into what the state's role actually was in these very early systems, because it wasn't what we might expect.
No, it was surprisingly limited at first. The earliest states, they really only got involved if the gods were offended or if the state itself was directly harmed, like treason or sacrilege.
So if someone punched you or stole your goat,
That was largely on you. It was a private matter. You or your family were expected to seek vengeance or compensation however you could manage it. The state might maybe act as a referee later, but it didn't initiate the process.
the responsibility was private. But you mentioned a huge exception, something that forced the state to get involved and really changed how crime was understood.
Yes, bloodshed,
Yeah.
killing someone. Whether it was murder or accidental manslaughter, that was different. That wasn't just a private wrong anymore.
Why? What made killing so different?
It all came down to religious ideas, really powerful ones. The person who shed blood was considered ritually impure, polluted.
Okay.
And that pollution didn't just stick to the killer, it defiled the community's gods. The whole city, the polis, was tainted by that act.
So it becomes a public problem, a religious crisis for everyone.
Precisely. If that pollution wasn't dealt with, wasn't ritually cleansed, people believed the gods might get angry. Crops could fail. Plagues could strike. It was a serious threat to the whole community's well-being.
So homicide wasn't just a crime against the victim's family. It was legally seen as a crime against the state's religion.
Exactly. And that forced the state to intervene. It had to create courts, procedures, rituals specifically to manage this religious impurity, to cleanse the community. It wasn't about sympathy for the victim initially. It was about appeasing the gods.
This shift from purely private revenge for killing to a state-managed process focused on religious cleansing, it really highlights a deep philosophical conflict, doesn't it?
It does. And the playwright Aeschylus just nails this in the Orestes trilogy. Orestes has a sacred duty to avenge his father, Agamemnon, by killing his mother, Clytemnestra. But killing his mother is also a horrific crime against blood ties. He's trapped.
It's vengeance versus vengeance, justice versus justice.
Yes. As Aeschylus puts it, Ares will confront Ares, Dica will confront Dica. Violence against violence, justice against justice. If justice itself is in conflict, the whole order of the universe feels chaotic.
It's an endless cycle of retribution that tears families and society apart.
And the solution Aeschylus presents, the way out of this cycle. It's not found within the family, the oikos with its blood feuds. It's found in the city, the polis, and its impartial law court established by the goddess Athena herself.
So the court steps in, judges the act publicly, determines guilt or innocence, and through that process, it performs a kind of ritual cleansing for the community. It contains the chaos.
That's the critical takeaway. The moment societies tried to move beyond the blood feud, they ran smack into this conflict. Your duty to your kin versus your duty to the city and its laws. The new written laws had to do more than just be clear in public. They had to handle this religious dimension, or the cycle of violence would just keep going.
Okay, so that sets the stage. The state takes over justice, partly for religious reasons, using written laws. How did this play out in practice, especially in a democracy like Athens?
Well, moving into the practicalities, Athens is a great case study. Solon's laws, as we said, formed the basis for a lot of private and criminal law for a long time, but the political and judicial setup, that went through what our sources call a real revolution.
Driven by this intense democratic spirit.
Absolutely, and the most visible symptom of that was the use of the lot, random selection.
They used it for, well, almost everything important, didn't they? Choosing magistrates, like the archons.
And crucially for the courts, assigning citizens as jurors, the dicasts, to these huge panels, sometimes hundreds, even thousands of jurors for a single case.
Why the obsession with the lot? What was the thinking there?
It was the ultimate expression of democratic equality. The idea was that every citizen was capable of judging and ruling, and the lot prevented any one group or powerful individual from dominating the process. It aimed for impartiality by randomization.
And they paid these jurors, right? So even poorer citizens could afford to participate.
Yes, a small daily fee. It was meant to ensure broad participation across society. On paper, it looks like a system designed to dilute power and ensure fairness.
But there's always a but.
There is. Even with clear laws and this randomized jury system, the courts were still deeply vulnerable to politics. The system could be, and absolutely was, weaponized.
How so? Give us an example.
Look at the famous Order Demosthenes. After Athens suffered a crushing military defeat at Chaeronea, his political enemies didn't necessarily charge him with cowardice in the legal sense that might have been hard to prove directly under the law, but they used his association with the defeat against him in other unrelated political trials. They attacked his character, implied he was unpatriotic or weak, playing on the public's emotions about the military disaster.
So even if the legal case itself was weak, the political atmosphere, the rhetoric, could sway these massive popular juries.
Absolutely. Public opinion, skillfully manipulated, could overwhelm the strict letter of the law, especially in politically charged cases. It shows the inherent fragility. The law was only as strong as the willingness to follow it impartially.
That's a sobering thought for any democratic system, ancient or modern. Okay, let's shift focus now to Rome. because the way power was structured there, particularly in the Republic, created its own set of problems, ultimately even more destructive ones.
Yes, the Roman Republic is fascinating because it kept all the old appearances, the popular assemblies still met, consuls were elected.
But the real power wasn't there.
Increasingly, no. The sources are clear. Overwhelming practical power became concentrated in the Senate, nominally just an advisory council of ex-magistrates, but in reality, it controlled the state.
What did that control look like day to day? What levers did the Senate actually pull?
The big ones. They decided on war and peace, they made treaties and alliances, they authorized the founding of new colonies, and absolutely critically, they controlled the state finances.
The money.
Completely.
Yeah.
The officials who managed the treasury couldn't spend a single sestertius without a decree from the Senate. They held the purse strings, and that gave them enormous leverage over everything else.
So what happened to the elected magistrates, like the consuls and praetors, the guys who were supposed to have imperium, the supreme executive authority?
They were still important, they presided over meetings, led armies, but they increasingly became like executive officers carrying out the Senate's decisions. Presidents of the Senate's sittings, almost.
But there was a mechanism, wasn't there, that allowed certain individuals to accumulate massive power outside the system, even with Senate approval, the thing that really paved the way for figures like Caesar.
Yes, and this is arguably the fatal flaw, the legal loophole that broke the Republic. The prolongation of command.
Explain that.
Okay, so a magistrate, especially a consul or praetor, would be assigned a province to govern, often involving military command, their imperium. Normally, this is for a fixed term, usually a year.
Right.
But the Senate could vote to extend that command, prorogue it. So the official continued to hold power pro-consul, acting in place of a consul, or pro-praetor, acting in place of a praetor, even though their elected term was up.
Initially, this was probably meant for practical reasons, like finishing a war without swapping commanders mid-campaign.
But it became routine.
It became dangerously routine, especially in the later Republic. The Senate could, and did, grant these extensions for years on end. Think of Caesar in Gaul, holding command for nearly a decade.
So the Senate, using this legal mechanism, was essentially creating long-term, unelected military governors who commanded huge, increasingly professional armies loyal to them, not necessarily to the state back in Rome. That's exactly it. It concentrated immense military and political power in the hands of individuals far from senatorial oversight, all technically sanctioned by a Senate decree. The Senate was, maybe unwittingly at first, creating the very warlords who would eventually destroy it.
And this whole system, concentrated power, prolonged command, it was especially toxic when applied to governing the provinces, wasn't it? That's where the money and the ambition really fueled the fire.
Oh, absolutely. Provincial administration is a key part of this story. Our sources often describe the governors as high-status amateurs.
Meaning?
Meaning they were typically senators, often former consuls or praetors, serving a short term, maybe just a year. Their main goal wasn't usually good governance for the provincials.
What was it then?
It was seen as a chance to recoup the massive expenses they'd incurred getting elected back in Rome, to enhance their personal status, and frankly, to make a fortune through various forms of exploitation before their term was up. They weren't career administrators, they were politicians looking to cash in.
And this exploitation, it wasn't just occasional bad apples, it was systemic.
So systemic that the Romans actually had to create a special permanent court in 149 BCE, the Quaestio de Repetendus, specifically to handle complaints from provincials about illegal extortion by governors.
So they recognized the problem and tried to fix it legally?
They tried. But here's the kicker, the real sign of how deep the rot went. Often, this court didn't actually stop the extortion. Instead, it sometimes ended up just establishing a sort of acceptable level of corruption.
Wait, what? They legalized it?
Not explicitly, but effectively, yes. By setting precedents about what level of financial extraction would actually get prosecuted, they created a sort of unspoken convention. As long as a governor didn't go too far beyond that customary level of abuse, they were likely safe. Only the most outrageous cases, or those politically motivated, tended to result in convictions.
That's incredible. It's like putting a price tag on justice. We have some pretty stark examples of this, right? Cicero's prosecution of Verres in Sicily comes to mind.
Verres is the poster child for this kind of sophisticated corruption. He didn't just crudely steal money, which might have been too obvious. He manipulated the legal mechanisms themselves.
How did he do it?
Well, governors had the legal right to requisition supplies from the province, grain, artwork, textiles, whatever Rome needed, or the governor fancied.
Okay, a legal right.
But Verres would say, demand huge amounts of high-quality grain.
Yeah.
When the local Sicilians delivered it, he'd find some pretext to reject it. Oh, it's not good enough quality.
All right.
But instead of just saying, take it back, he'd then demand the cash equivalent of the grain he'd supposedly rejected. The Sicilians were forced to pay him the money. Verres pocketed untraceable cash. And technically, he could claim he was just enforcing quality standards for requisitions.
Pure legal manipulation for personal profit. It's malice disguised as administration.
Exactly. And it shows how the system itself, designed for governance, was actively subverted by the very people entrusted with upholding it. This failure to control greed and power, both through prolonged commands and provincial exploitation, leads directly to figures like Caesar having the wealth and military backing to challenge the Republic itself.
Which brings us back to the legal framework. Did the Romans themselves recognize these tensions? How did their legal philosophy try to grapple with this?
They certainly did. Roman jurists were brilliant, and they developed a complex understanding of different types of law, which is essential if we want to understand how they thought about these crises. They didn't just have one monolithic law.
Right. They distinguished between law for citizens and law for interacting with everyone else.
Primarily, yes. You had the jus civil, the civil law. This was the old traditional law of Rome, often quite formal and ritualistic, that applied only to Roman citizens.
And then the jus gentium.
The law of nations, or maybe better, the law of peoples. This developed more pragmatically. As Rome expanded and interacted with more foreigners, peregrini, who lived or traded there, they needed rules. Foreigners weren't bound by the ancient jus civile.
So the jus gentium was more like common sense principles,
Yeah.
rules that seemed fair and were recognized across different cultures.
Exactly. It was less formal, based on shared understandings of fairness, things like rules for contracts, property, dealing with captives in war. It was the law Rome used in its international relations and with non-citizens within its borders.
Cicero had some high ideals about this, didn't he? He wanted the local Roman law to reflect these broader, more universal principles.
He did. He wrote that while the jus civile didn't necessarily need to incorporate every aspect of jus gentium, the jus gentium absolutely should be part of the jus civile. He saw the law of nations as reflecting a more universal natural justice that Roman law should aspire to.
But he also admitted they weren't quite there.
Yeah, he famously lamented that Rome often dealt in mere shadows and images of true justice, not the real thing. There was this constant awareness of the gap between the ideal, a kind of perfect universal natural law, and the messy reality of running an empire built on conquest and, let's be honest, often brutal self-interest.
This idea of natural law, just natural, seems important here. The idea that there are inherent principles of justice, discoverable by reason, that underpin all valid law.
Very important. Later Roman jurists often looked back at the simplicity and directness of Rome's earliest laws and saw in them an echo of this natural law.
How did that influence things practically, like the jus gentium?
Well, take rules about war and property. A core idea in early jus gentium, likely reflecting battlefield reality, was that enemy property captured in war was considered res nullius, belonging to no one, and could therefore be claimed by the first Roman soldier or the state to occupy it.
So finders, keepers, basically, on a grand scale.
Pretty much. Later, jurists rationalized this by linking it to natural law principles of acquisition. It provided a kind of legal justification for conquest and plunder. If you won the war, taking the enemy's stuff wasn't just looting. It was a legally recognized transfer of ownership under the law of nations, rooted in natural principles.
That's a convenient legal theory for an expanding empire.
It certainly aligned with Roman practice. Now, shifting from these big categories down to everyday dealings, the Romans also developed a crucial concept meant to inject morality into law: bona fides.
Good faith. We still talk about this today.
We do, and for the Romans, it was a powerful legal principle. Quintus Scaevola, a hugely respected jurist and high priest, said that the greatest legal force lay in judgments, where the formula specifically included the phrase, in good faith.
So it wasn't just a suggestion, it was legally binding.
Absolutely. If a contract or arrangement was supposed to be carried out ex vita bona, it meant it had to be done with genuine honesty, fairness, and transparency, considering the intent and not just the bare minimum wording. It applied to vital areas like trusts, partnerships, buying and selling things essential for communal life.
It was a direct counter to the kind of sneaky legal maneuvering we saw with Verres.
Precisely. Cicero railed against what he called astuteness or malice that wishes itself to seem to be prudence. He argued true prudence involves choosing good over bad, while malice deliberately twists things for selfish ends. The legal system, through bona fides, was actively trying to enforce moral substance over mere technical compliance.
It's an attempt to anchor the law in something more than just rules. But there was another anchor, wasn't there? The sacred, the religious constraints.
Yes, we can't forget the role of religio. Roman law was deeply intertwined with religious concepts, and crucially, not everything sacred was necessarily owned or consecrated by the state. Some things were simply religiosum affected by taboo.
So, inherently off limits, even without a specific state decree.
Kind of. The jurist Aelius Gallus defined religiosum as something relating to which there were things a person just could not do without appearing to act against the god's will. These were powerful, often unspoken, religious prohibitions that had legal weight.
What's a key example?
Burial grounds. A place where a body was buried became locus religiosus, a taboo place. This automatically made it extra commercium. It couldn't be bought or sold, couldn't be part of ordinary commerce. This wasn't necessarily because the state declared it sacred, but because the deep-seated ancient belief that such places were inherently untouchable due to the presence of the dead.
So religious taboo created legally enforceable restrictions on property and action?
Yes, and this blending is critical for understanding crises like Caesar's assassination. If a leader, like Caesar, held not only immense political and military power, but also the chief religious office, Pontifex Maximus, then attacking him wasn't just a political act. For many, it could be seen as religiosum, a violation of sacred taboo, a crime against the gods as much as against the state. That massively complicates the question of treason versus tyrannicide.
Right, the lines blur completely. Let's bring this down to the individual level now. How did these legal structures, these tensions between community, state, and individual rights, play out for ordinary Romans, particularly regarding status?
Okay, let's start with something really basic. Making a will, passing on your property. Today, we see that as a fundamental individual right.
But it wasn't always so simple in Rome.
Not at all, especially in early Rome. Ancient religious thinking viewed the individual primarily as a temporary caretaker for the immortal family line, responsible for maintaining the family's continuity and its obligations to its ancestral gods.
So your property wasn't really yours to dispose of freely.
Not entirely. Early Roman wills weren't just private documents you wrote up. To be valid, especially if they altered the natural line of succession dictated by religious custom, they often required approval from the highest public authority, meaning the will had to be approved by the entire community, assembled in their voting units, the curiae, with the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, presiding. It was effectively like passing a special law just for your family, getting public and religious sanction to change the sacred order of inheritance.
Wow. That's a huge restriction on personal autonomy. Your family's religious obligations and the community's approval trumped your individual wishes.
It shows how deeply embedded the individual was within the collective religious framework. It wasn't until much later that Roman jurists started arguing, influenced by ideas of natural law, that the power to make a will, testatio, was a natural consequence of owning property, shifting the emphasis towards individual rights. It reflects a slow but significant secularization.
Okay, so individual rights evolved. What about facing the law when accused of a crime? Did it differ depending on the crime?
Absolutely. There was a major distinction. You had judicia populi, public trials usually held before the popular assemblies, for crimes considered to be against the state itself. Treason, electoral bribery, perhaps major violent crimes that disturb public order. Political crimes, essentially.
And in those cases, there was sometimes a way out.
Sometimes. For many political offenses, if things looked bad, the accused might be able to go into voluntary exile before the final verdict was rendered. They'd lose their property, their citizenship, but they'd save their life. It was a kind of political safety valve, though Cicero notes it wasn't available for the most heinous crimes, like parricidium, killing a close relative. That was too fundamental a violation.
But what about ordinary private crimes? Disputes between individuals, theft, assault?
That was the idicium privatum, the private judgment. The process here had roots in vengeance. If the judge found against the wrongdoer, the outcome was stark. The guilty person was essentially handed over to the injured party. Pretty much. The sources say the judge awarded the person at stake to the victim, who could then, depending on the specifics, kill them, sell them into slavery abroad, or imprison them until the debt or damages were satisfied.
So no chance of skipping town then?
None. In these private cases, because the debt or the injury was owed directly to the other individual, not the state, there was no possibility of voluntary exile. You were effectively the property of the person you wronged until the score was settled. It's a much harsher, more ancient form of justice surviving alongside the political processes.
This really underscores the massive legal inequalities built into the Roman system, which ultimately underpin the power structure we were talking about. The most obvious example being slavery.
The scale is just staggering. By a late republic, the time of Caesar, estimates suggest slaves made up maybe 35, possibly even 40% of the population in Italy. Millions of people with virtually no legal rights.
So legal inequality wasn't just a side effect, it was foundational to the economy, the social structure, everything.
It absolutely was. And even if you were lucky enough to gain your freedom, becoming a freedman or freedwoman, you still weren't fully equal. The law deliberately kept you subordinate to your former owner, your patron.
How did that work legally?
The patron retained significant rights and expectations of deference. A key example from our sources is the actio injuriarum, the legal action one could bring for being insulted or physically harassed.
Okay.
Generally speaking, a freedman could not bring this action against his patron.
Meaning the patron could insult or even discipline their former slave without facing legal consequences?
Within limits, yes. The sources suggest a patron could inflict reasonable chastisement or verbal abuse, even extending to the freedman's wife, with legal impunity. It was built into the relationship the freedman owed respect and service, and the patron retained a level of authority.
So even freedom didn't erase the fundamental power imbalance enforced by law.
Not completely. This legal hierarchy, from the senator down to the slave, reinforced the power of the elite at every level. It guaranteed a massive pool of dependent labor and ensured deference. This whole structure, built on legal vulnerability and status, is what fueled the relentless drive for wealth, power, and status among the elite, the very ambition that the Republic's legal and political system ultimately couldn't contain, especially when it manifested as overwhelming military force in the hands of someone like Caesar.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together.
So what we've really dug into today is this incredibly complex Roman legal and political landscape. It was sophisticated, no doubt written laws, specialized courts, philosophical ideas like good faith, trying to ensure fairness.
But it was all built on or layered over much older foundations.
Exactly. Ancient ideas about religious taboo, the need to cleanse communal pollution, the raw impulse of blood vengeance, these never fully disappeared. They coexisted, often uneasily, with the more formal republican structures.
And this hybrid system, despite its brilliance, had critical weaknesses.
It did. Crucially, it lacked clear, enforceable legal mechanisms to deal with individuals who amassed overwhelming power, the kind of power made possible by those very loopholes we discussed, like prorogued commands and the riches pouring in from exploited provinces.
When a figure like Caesar emerged, commanding immense wealth and legions loyal only to him, the legal system just short-circuited.
Essentially, yes. What legal process could possibly indict or prosecute a victorious general at the head of a massive army camped just outside Rome? The law relied on consent and the ability to enforce its judgments, and that broke down. The only answers left seemed to be political maneuvering or outright violence.
So the failure wasn't just about ambitious individuals, it was baked into the system. The way it mixed the sacred and secular, the way it allowed amateur, profit-driven governors, the way the Senate itself created the conditions for its own obsolescence.
I think that's fair to say. The system couldn't legally contain the power it paradoxically enabled. And that's why the question surrounding Caesar's death becomes so fundamental. Was it treason against the legitimate, albeit overpowering, leader? Or was it tyrannicide, a desperate act to save the Republic's constitution, however flawed?
The law itself offered no clear answer. It became purely a political question, decided by civil war.
Which is the ultimate constitutional failure.
So here's a final thought, something for you to chew on until our next deep dive. The Republic failed to legally resolve this treason versus tyrannicide dilemma. The solution that eventually emerged was the empire, the principate. Augustus, the first emperor, was careful initially, calling himself just princeps, first among equals. But over time, the emperor became increasingly remote, increasingly sacred, surrounded by court ritual, eventually even considered divine. Was this the ultimate, perhaps unintentional answer to the Republic's crisis? By making the leader effectively sacred, did the empire remove him from the messy realm of ordinary civil and political law altogether? Did it solve the problem of defining the crime against the leader by making any such act unambiguous sacrilege, a religious violation rather than a political one? Did they just elevate the leader so far above the law that challenging him became unthinkable in legal terms?
That's a fascinating question. Did they solve the constitutional crisis by essentially dissolving the Constitution as the Republic knew it, replacing legal checks with divine authority? Definitely something to ponder.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us as we've navigated the intricate and ultimately tragic legal framework of the late Roman Republic.
A pleasure, as always.
We look forward to digging into another set of sources with you next time on The Deep Dive.